Well, it is such a pleasure to see everybody again tonight. Obviously, my students, thank you for coming. Everybody else who's in this space, who I'm so thrilled to have in here. This is our final speaker of the Lavender Library series for fall 2023, Dr. Matthew Lovett. And I am particularly thrilled to have Dr. Lovett here for a variety of reasons. One, we went to grad school together.
Yes.
So I got to know Dr. Lovett at graduate school at Duquesne University, where we both did our PhDs. And lots of really interesting conversations over many different principal thinkers. I was just speaking to my students in my class about Butler and just saying, yeah, well, obviously Dr. Lovett's going to know a lot about that too. So that's really exciting. Yeah, I was going to say, absolutely, actually. I'm also really excited because one of the kind of recurring things that we've noticed through the Lavender Library series is really how important it is to understand the value of queer theory, queer research, queer work, along with queer experience, along with queer joy. I know you're going to be talking about some things that are kind of fun things as well. And also along with the recognition that it's really important for us to have spaces in which we can understand who we are, investigate who we are, and be supported through that investigation. And Dr. Lovett's work really engages with all of this. His background in continental philosophy, his background in psychoanalysis, his background in being a professor of gender, it's women's genders and sexuality studies.
Gender,
I forget
sexuality.
the order. Okay.
Gender,
Yeah.
sexuality, women's.
Thank you. University of Pittsburgh. Everybody has a different order to that, right? The University of Pittsburgh has gender, sexuality, women's studies. But that intersection of those backgrounds, right, is exactly at this point where we can see the value and importance of having a space for investigating, both because it helps to enrich what we know and also because it helps to enrich who we are and how we see ourselves and how it can be validated and seen in a space. So I'm really, really thankful for Dr. Lovett being able to do that as well. I'm going to turn it over to him since I already delayed us so much by having some little hiccups with class things before class. But I am just thrilled. So join me in welcoming Dr. Lovett.
All right, thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much, team, Dr. Duncan. A couple caveats. I tend to be long-winded, and my talk's already a little long, so if I jump around a little, you don't follow me, you can ask about it. I tend to speak, sometimes my voice doesn't project, and I tend to speak quickly, so if you can't follow me, you can just... Oh, that's someone. Oh, I thought that was someone already. I can't hear you, yeah. So yeah, and I have a personal, I keep calling this invitation to come here a personal, professional, and cosmic win, because I actually I was born and raised in Arkansas, in Jonesboro, if you're familiar with Jonesboro. And so to be flown back to my home state to talk about my nerdy interests and my queerness for a queer organization at the University of Central Arkansas in Conway, Arkansas, it's not something that I ever thought was going to happen. So it's really, if I cry with me. How many of you, just out of curiosity, are from Arkansas? Okay, so most of you. Anybody from Jonesboro or been to Jonesboro? Oh, really? Did you go to JHS?
No, I went to the west side.
Okay, cool. You're from Jonesboro?
I brought a family there.
Okay. Well, yeah, so my parents still live there. So having that in mind, my background is in philosophy, psychoanalysis. I'm trained to be a psychoanalyst, so I'm pretty theory heavy. But I thought for this talk, I would try to I kind of divided it into 3 parts informally. The first is kind of a personal narrative of what it was like growing up queer in Jonesboro, Arkansas. It's a nerdy, it wasn't pre-internet, but it was, in the early stages of that. And that is the narrative that leads into how I got into studying this stuff in undergrad and grad school. Then I'm going to go into some history of, so I called the talk Psychoanalysis Has Always Been Queer, and if you looked at the abstract, admittedly that's not true, right? So then I'm going to give you some history, you might know some of this, but some history of institutional homophobia in psychoanalysis and psychiatry. And then I'm going to show why claim that despite all that, I would believe that psychoanalysis is necessarily a queer field, a queer discipline. And so that will engage with some queer theory. Towards the end of the talk, the language does get a little more explicit. So just FYI, there will be some accounts of sexual practices. I hope that's okay. If you want to leave, I'll tell you when that's coming up. And if you want to leave, you can. But that's the fun stuff I'm sure the taking. But insofar as queer theory is sort of about sex and sexual practices, that's it. All right, so just, I didn't really know where to start. I wrote some stuff down and they just extemporize. I was born in Jonesboro, Arkansas. My parents still live. I went to JHS. My mother tells me now that she knew I was gay when I was 2. I knew but didn't know, and it was clear, but growing up in this part of the world, well, growing up in lots of places, there was a lot of Southern Baptistry stuff around me, which is no fault to that necessarily, but it gave me a lot of stress, right? Because once puberty hit, like even though I sort of acted the same way with all this gesture, it's not a huge surprise that I turned out to be gay. But I had a lot of I didn't suffer a lot of bullying or anything like that. One guy used to send me death threats all the time. But it was more because he called me king of the emo kids than because of my purported sexuality. But I was bullied mostly actually by a woman who turns out to be a lesbian, which I think there was all sorts of psychic processes going on there. So no big deal. But I would go to youth group, and homosexuality was always something that was wrong. Sexual sin was wrong. Actually, in my sex and sexualities class, I have a whole week on purity culture and abstinence culture. And so, they have anti-masturbation manuals, and they have all sorts of stuff. And homosexuality is just, the worst. So post-puberty, or whatever, I would, be into guys, but I would convince myself that I wasn't, that it was an aberration. I would or how graphic I could be, do stuff that hormonal teenage boys do. And then be like, oh, you have a crush on this girl, right? Which of course was not true. Well, maybe I tried to make it true, it didn't work. And so the reason I mentioned pre-internet is because now, we didn't have, I got a smartphone when I was in college, but we didn't have one before that. So we did have the internet. We got dial-up in 7th grade. I had a live journal. I would secretly sneak onto gay websites, and then they would take over the computer, and I'd be like, oh God, I've been found out. So I have all this anxiety, this sort of cognitive dissonance about what I wanted and who I thought I was and who I wanted to be, etc. And it was stressful. Well, this is why one thing that I'll say throughout the text is, even though that kind of sucks, it was necessary. It didn't have to be necessary, but it's necessary for me to tell as part of my trajectory, because I consider being queer a mode of inquiry more than I consider it to be a kind of sexual practice. And there's a lot to say about that if you're curious. But for me, basically, I was also PhD in philosophy, a nerd, big old nerd. I was very academically, whatever, I hate the word gifted, but did all that stuff. So my way of trying to get to know myself and the world that I was having a difficult time finding myself in was through academic stuff. It was, I'm still proud of getting a 5 on the AP chemistry exam, right? It's just ridiculous. I'm almost 40. But so, it was always academic. And so what I did to try to find my way through the world, I read everything. I would go to the public library, RIP library. And in particular, there was a store called Hastings, which no longer exists, but you remember Hastings? So I would just wander through and find anything in the independent film section that looked kind of queer, kind of fruity, or even just sort of sexual. I would go through the electronic music used CDs and be like, this will make me cool. This will show them that I'm not like them, kind of like teenage rebellion sort of stuff. But that led me to read just everything I could. I saw all sorts of movies that I'm sure I shouldn't have seen at that age, right? The night before I took the SAT, if you know who Greg Araki is, I saw this movie called The Doom Generation. I watched it 3 times and didn't sleep the night before I took the SAT, whatever. And so I found out that was part of what's called New Queer Cinema. So I don't know how Hastings had all this weird, this stuff that I loved it. And I'm glad that happened. But so, I would read William Burroughs, I'd read Anais Nin and Henry Miller because I was just like, this is what I'm supposed to do, and I did like it. I tried to read Infinite Jest in high school. And that was foolish. And then I went to governor school. Anybody go to governor school? You did? Okay. You're familiar with what that is? Okay. So it was at Hendrix, actually, when I did it. And that was really transformative. It was the first time that I was away from all the people in high school. It was a whole bunch of weirdos who were smart and inquisitive and self-critical in a positive way. And so that was really, I cried. We all cried when it ended because it was like sort of this first, we found ourselves in kind of a way. And that's where I first read French philosophy. I had this guy, a former sergeant, whose last name was Slaughter, so it was Sergeant Slaughter. He had us read Derrida and Bard. And so I just thought that their hooks were in theory stuff. And so for me, as I said before, philosophy, queer theory, I didn't know what queer theory was at the time. Philosophy as a mode of inquiry and queerness as a mode of inquiry were coextensive. I thought I was going to be a chemistry major in college, but I took philosophy of mind, and I got a C on my first exam, which I had never seen before, and it was his. So I figured out how to get better at it, and then then I just got sucked in. I took 2 philosophy senior seminars or 2 senior theses. I took social theory, I took lit theory, I took all that sort of stuff. And so that sort of shifted me, much to my parents' dismay, from chemistry pre-med to philosophy and women's studies, which is what they called it. I went to Rhodes up the street in Memphis. And so, excuse me, my sophomore year of college, I took feminist theory, which definitely shaped the way that I think more than anything. And interestingly enough, it's the class that I teach the most at Pitt. I teach it at least twice a semester. It's actually what they hired me to teach feminist theory. And sometimes people are like, you're a boy. And that hasn't really been a problem, but I have curiosities about that. I always felt I was attuned to injustices against women and queer people, but I never thought of myself as a feminist, because growing up in Arkansas in the 90s, it didn't really come up so much for me. But that reading Foucault, reading Butler, reading Irigaray, reading Fatigue, all this sort of stuff that totally reshaped what I thought. And simultaneous to that, I was getting to know all these queer vagrants in Memphis. I dated an indie filmmaker. Some of my friends lived in a queer and trans commune. Really just a house. Called Declare. And so all this stuff was happening at once. I finally came out, and this is an embarrassing story. The first night I got drunk in college, don't do that. I was vomiting from being drunk. And I was like, I'm gay. It was like, so all this stuff is happening at once. And so for me, again, all this stuff is quite important. That's also where I first encountered some psychoanalytic stuff, right? A lot of queer theory. So for my final paper in feminist theory, I wrote what I thought was a radical queer critique of gay marriage. And I read basically the University of Memphis Philosophy Department's reading list for queer theory. And I read some Jacqueline Rose, among other folks. And she has this line that I'll never forget. It's very simple, but she says, there's a resistance to identity at the heart of psychic life. So thinking about how I never knew who I was, and I never knew what my sexuality was, or I couldn't come to terms with it, and then reading all this stuff about the embodiment, I was like, I don't even know what it means to be embodied, right? What does it mean to have a sex? What does it mean to be sexed? What does it mean to have bodily materiality? What does it mean to desire? So reading all this stuff plus thinking about it myself put the fire in me, as it were. So I had kind of like simultaneous, this is very philosophy, undergrad philosophy nerd. I had like existential dread and existential optimism at the same time. And so these questions have never left me, like whether it's talking about identity, desire, sexuality, etc. But I'm saying that to set the stage for why I've gravitated so much towards psychoanalysis. And I'll talk a lot more about psychoanalysis later, but I just at least want to say that. So when I got to graduate school, where I'm attained, I did the Women's and Gender Studies certificate, where you have to like do your own research in your classes, because the philosophy department didn't have any Women's and Gender Studies classes like at all. So we had to do our own research, which gave me lots of leeway. And I realized that the question I thought was the most important was the problem or question of sexual difference, as I said before. What is sexual difference? Is it a personal identity? Is it embodiment? Is it externally attributed? Is it determined by chromosomes, by hormones, by genitalia, by anatomy? How many mismatches can there be? how do we accommodate queer, trans, and cis identities all throughout this and intersex bodies. And so I ended up writing my dissertation, soon to be a book, you should buy it. Just kidding. On that. And I still think that's a very important problem. I don't know if anyone's read any Lucy Irigaray, but she, this is kook, but she wrote, the first chapter is actually on Barbara Irigaray, and she famously wrote that sexual difference is the philosophical problem of our time. And I think that's still true. I think it manifests in all sorts of different ways. We see it all around us right now, but I think that's still the problem that I want to investigate. And I tried to write my dissertation on Hegel and Aristotle and sexual difference. It's just silly. And then I read this guy called Deleuze, and I realized psychoanalysis was really the center of it, in particular this guy called Lacan, but I won't really get into that. In case you can ask me if you want to. So I realized that really what was the most driving and compelling account I could come up with that could account for and not disparage or denigrate any of these different forms of feeling sexuated or sexed was through psychoanalysis. And so again, being queer was a mode of inquiry and always connected to feeling out of joint, which I also think what philosophy and psychoanalysis do, or what they're concerned with. They also, interestingly enough, so psychoanalysis for me is the field that takes sexuality as determinative and as undermining the most seriously, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about what philosophy and queer theory want us to do too. So as subjects riven with desires, contradictions, futures, past, and inconsistencies, we're always apart from ourselves, which I think characterizes queer theory's use of the word queer. So I know some of you have read some queer theory. My favorite definition of the word queer comes from David Halpern's book, Saint Foucault, where he argues that there's nothing to which it necessarily refers. Queer in queer theory means to be anti-normative, going against the norm, which may not be the most elegant formulation because what we mean by norm and normative, but that's this sort of idea of a cut or negativity of queerness, just like in psychoanalysis and philosophy, I think is important. So that also reminds me of some of the, basic adages of Western philosophy. Know thyself, wisdom is knowing that you know nothing, all of philosophy begins in wonder, all humans by nature desire to know, and everything has been figured out except how to live. Those are from Sartre going all the way back to Thales. So that's sort of the personal narrative I wanted to give you about how I came to be what I jokingly call a professional homosexual. Not what I expected to be, right? So since the talk is not narrative, I'm going to read a little more now because this is going to be a little more historical. Because like I said, I'm making the claim that is demonstrably false that psychoanalysis has always been queer. So my friend called it tactical negation, so I'll go with that. But so what I need to do, I think I need to acknowledge, and I'm going to do this at length, and I hope it's not stuff you already know, is explain or show some ways in which psychoanalysis and psychiatry, which I'm conflating here, even though they're not really conflatable any longer, has been homophobic, right? But so one thing I want to do before that, get ahead of myself all the time, is sort of give some indication of why psychoanalysis finds sex so significant. So to do that, a brief description of the field of sexology, which is an emergent field in the 19th century, primarily in Germany, which was undertaken by a variety of people, some of whom were gay men who wanted to decriminalize their sexuality, some of whom were women who wanted to prove that they're not the weaker sex, some of whom were just researchers who thought they were collating information. So the study of sex emerges through the also kind of coextensive also with urbanization and capitalist modes of labor, which allow groups of weirdos to come together in urban areas and find each other, right? So this is sort of Gail Rubin and John D'Amelio's argument. So you can, it's kind of hard. Well, this is not true because you can identify as gay and not actually have gay sex, but it's harder. It's more satisfying for a lot of people to actually have gay comrades and gay sexual partners. So urbanization allows for that to be possible. So this is sort of what I think relevant to it as well. So some figures, Karl Heinrich Ulrich, who wanted to prove that homosexuality should not be a crime, Carol Benny, who coined the term homosexuality in 1869, Carl Westphal, used the phrase contrary feeling to claim that homosexuality was inborn and an illness, not a crime, and Richard von Krafft-Ebing. Krafft-Ebing believed that sexuality was the most important factor in social existence, but he believed all non-reproductive sex to be perverse. And so this attention to perversion led him to publish a notorious text called Psychoanalysis that describes the various non-reproductive sexual activities that people engage in, which are, I think, most sexual activities, in fact. But in this work, he denoted 4 broad categories of perversion: homosexuality, fetishism, I could say more about all these, sadism, and masochism. So differing views abounded, whether perverts were sinful, poorly evolved, criminal, deranged. Krafft-Ebing ultimately concluded that, quote, in view of the realization that contrary sexuality is a congenital anomaly, that it represents a disturbance in the evolution of the sexual life towards monosexuality and of normal psychical and somatic development in relationship to the kind of reproductive glands possessed by the individual, it is no longer possible to maintain the idea of degenerate disease in this connection. Surprise. And if one can prove that, relatively speaking, heterosexuals are apt to be much more depraved than homosexuals. So you can see a tension here, right, where he's saying there is a telos or an aim of sexuality, but most people don't meet it. Right? And so there are other folks, Magnus Hirschfeld, Kinsey, etc., who sort of put sex Kinsey's after Freud, sex at the forefront of this kind of investigation, social and personal investigation. This is all a summation to show what sort of prefiguring Freud. Right? So Freud wasn't supposed to be a psychoanalyst. He studied eels originally. I don't know if you knew that, like electricity and eels. And but Freud emerges out of this sort of realm of sexology. He's not exactly a sexologist, but I think it's relevant to recognize that influence on him. So for Freud, after all, human character, behavior, and dysfunction all stem from infantile sexuality, and this remains true for psychoanalysis now, or at least for some fields. Whether we call it libido or jouissance or something else, sexuality remains at the heart of psychoanalytic thinking. So I'll return to more of that later, but I'm sure everyone knows who Freud is. Of course, it's silly for me to even say this. Whether you like him or not, bear with me. So Freud had many insights that stick with us today, of course, the conception of infantile sexuality, the stages of sexual development, the practice of the talking cure, the Oedipus complex that dramatizes the process of psychic and sexual identification, his positing or discovery of the unconscious, and so on. So some people think that Freud has a normative and unidirectional model of heterosexuality, right? And there are certainly parts of Freud that indicate that. But in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud posited that all infinites, the feminine, sorry, that's Lacan. Freud posited that all infants are born polymorphously perverse, meaning that everything carries with it potentially an erotic charge. Sexual drives and erogenous, for instance, are multiple and emergent stages, including oral, anal, latent, and genital. Thus, it's only over time that sexuality becomes organized around the genitals, which would be reproductive heterosexual sex. And indeed, there are, as we know, erogenous zones in the mouth and anus, for instance, or really anywhere in your body that may have nothing to do with genitalia. But in some readings of Freud and in some parts of Freud, the genital or phallic stage is supposed to supervene over all of these, or superimpose itself over all these partial zones and their objects to organize the body in the manner of reproductive heterosexuality. Indeed, at times, Freud seems to suggest that the mature feminine woman has to give up clitoral activity for vaginal passivity, which is, of course, in line with normative heterosexual reproduction and also normative femininity. So it doesn't seem super queer, does it? Also, in 3 essays, he seems to follow Krafft-Ebing in listing the heteros of perversion, fetishism, homosexuality, sadism, and masochism. Now, I found, I've taught for a long time. I started teaching in grad school, but I've taught at Pitt since 2016. And I found whenever I mentioned Freud in class, it was pretty much derided, right? So he's diminished as an old relic, a masculinist, penis-obsessed man who slept with his patients and did mounds of cocaine. And even if any of this is true, and some of it certainly is, his contribution to the field of psychoanalysis have implications beyond this, which is kind of what I get. It may well seem like psychoanalysis presumes that one should become heterosexual out of their polymorphous perversity, and all resultant perversions are simply evidence of so-called arrested development. So I do all this to show, regrettably, the many ways that psychoanalysis has not been queer or queer friendly. So for his part, thank you, Freud did not seem to have any moral issue with heterosexuality. In a now famous letter to an American mother in 1935, famously wrote, quote, "I gather that your son is a homosexual. I'm most impressed by the fact that you do not mention this term yourself in your information about him. And may I question you why you avoid it? Homosexuality is surely no advantage, but is nothing to be ashamed of, no vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness, be considered to be a variation of the sexual function produced by a certain arrest of sexual development." Similar to Kaftabi. Alas, many psychoanalysts not, and I'll come back to some of this in a second, many psychoanalysts not adopt this perspective of Freud's. As reported in many places, but I'll just reference Henry Abelove's Freud, Male Homosexuality in the Americans. It was particularly American inheritors of psychoanalysis who were the most explicitly homophobic. Primarily drawn from the work of Hungarian psychoanalyst Sanderado, who viewed homosexuality as, they were drawn primarily from this guy, who viewed homosexuality as a mental illness produced by bad parenting, usually an overbearing mother and a distant father, of course. That this was a flaw that could be cured or treated. Edmund Bergler, a leading psychoanalyst of the late 50s, wrote this about homosexuals, quote, "I have no bias against homosexuals. For me, they are sick people requiring medical help. Still, though, I have no bias, I would say. Homosexuals are essentially disagreeable people, regardless of their pleasant or outward manner. Their shell is a mixture of superciliousness, fake aggression, and whimpering." Thank you. Bye. And so there are still more examples of medical and psychoanalytic homophobia that occurred in the name of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, the field which is rooted in sex and founded by Freud, which I'm nevertheless going to call queer despite all of this that's going to come. Right? So as I said before, I'm going to run a little slipshod over the differences between psychiatry and psychoanalysis for these purposes. So in 1952, when the APA published the first diagnostic and statistical manual, they classified homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. As shown in the recent 2020 documentary Cured, when homosexuality was considered an illness, gay people were subjected to aversion therapy, conversion therapy, electroshock therapy, castration, and lobotomy. So I'm going to give you a couple of anecdotes, or a couple of reports of some things that were done against homosexuals in the name of curing them. Right? So here's a report from the 1976 Brussels Tribunal on Crimes Against Women. A lesbian in Oslo was in a heterosexual marriage that didn't work, so she started taking tranquilizers and ended up at the health sanatorium for treatment and rehab. The moment she said in family group therapy that she believed she was a lesbian, the doctor told her she was not. He knew it from looking into her eyes. She had the eyes of a woman who wanted sexual intercourse with her husband. It's not funny, I'm sorry. So she was subjected to so-called couch therapy. She was put into a comfortably heated room, naked on a bed, and for an hour, her husband was to try to excite her sexually. The idea was that the touching was always to end with sexual intercourse. She felt stronger and stronger aversion. She threw up and sometimes ran out of the room to avoid this treatment. The more strongly she asserted that she was a lesbian, the more violent the forced heterosexual intercourse became. This treatment went on for 6 months. She escaped from the hospital, was brought back. Again, she escaped. She has not been there since. In the end, she realized that she had been subjected to forcible sexual assault for 6 months. Right. In a foundational text on lesbian history by Lillian Faderman called Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it. She shows us that many mid-century psychoanalysts assumed that homosexuality, which it equated with gender inversion, could and should be cured. They boasted about the rates of success. So, for instance, Ferdinand Lundberg and Martina Farnham's Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, and William Niederland's Masculine Women Are Cheating Love, argue that post-war changes in gender roles were psychically problematic. They argued that the freedom brought about by the easing of gender roles during and after the Second World War brought about a neurosis, a deep illness that serves as the fertile soil for the seeds of sexual inversion. Mm-hmm. So the DSM listed homosexuality as a disorder in 1973, until 1973 when it was removed, but it was then replaced with ego-dystonic sexuality disorder. So I don't know if you know this history, so just a little bit about it. The battle for the removal was led primarily by a small group of queer, lesbian, gay activists, but two really sort of stood out as the leaders, Barbara Giddings and Frank Kameny. Under their activist lead in 1970, gay and lesbian rights groups picketed the annual APA conference in San Francisco. The next year, they infiltrated the meetings themselves, and Kameny grabbed the microphone and declared, quote, "Psychiatry is the enemy incarnate. Psychiatry has waged a relentless war of extermination against us. You may take this as a declaration of war against you," end quote. So, that got their attention. And for the next APA conference, they organized a panel called Psychiatry, Friend or Foe to the Homosexual. That was in Dallas. So they want to convince them to take this out of the DSM so they stop having medical justification for these horrific practices. Well, I think most of us probably do. But they need to convince psychiatrists who clearly are not sympathetic to them so far. So what they have to do is get a gay psychiatrist to testify, basically. But people don't want to do that because then they're outing themselves and you can get fired, potentially arrested, you can be called up. Not in the 70s, you wouldn't be subject to McCarthyism, but, vestiges of that went through. So they find this guy named John Fryer, if you've heard of him. If you Google him, you can see a picture of him testifying. He only agrees to do it wearing a mask and a voice distorter. Because he had been fired from his job at Penn by being outed by his cousins. And so he wants to work, needs to work. And so he says, "I was feeling insecure, but I thought about it and realized it was something that had to be done. I'd been thrown out of a residency because I was gay. I'd lost a job because I was gay. That perspective needed to be heard from a gay psychiatrist." So ultimately, this was effective. The APA was pulled, and a majority voted to remove homosexuality from DSM in 73. It wasn't until 87 that homosexuality was fully removed, and not everyone was on board with the APA's vote. In particular, this man, Charles Socarides, who remained until his death steadfast in his anti-gay beliefs, and in 1992 he founded the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, which still to this day advocates for the conversion therapy, which the APA now. Ironically, he has a gay son. So the relationship between psychoanalysis and transness is also fraught. In 1980, and I could give you more of this history if you like, but in 1980, the DSM added transsexualism as an official disorder. This is in one way was considered a victory since it established differential diagnostic criteria that allowed people to access care, but in another it was a Pyrrhic victory because then it codified them as this sort of problem. There's a good history of this from Sandy Stone. So here are a couple examples of that. In the late 1970s, psychoanalyst Leslie Lothstein, who did a lot of work with trans folks, for better or worse, in his study of 10 aging transsexuals, I'm using that term because that's the direct quote here, with an average age of 52, found that psychological testing helped to determine the extent of the patient's pathology. He concluded that transsexuals as a class were depressed, isolated, withdrawn, schizoid individuals with profound dependency conflicts. Furthermore, they were immature, narcissistic, egocentric, and potentially explosive, while their attempts to obtain professional assistance were demanding, manipulative, controlling, coercive, and paranoid. Around the same time, in a study of 56 trans folks, the results on schizophrenia and depression scales were outside the upper limit of the normal range. The authors of this published study see these profiles as reflecting the confused and bizarre lifestyles of the subject. In 1981, a famous Lacanian psychoanalytic text on the subject of transness was published. It's called Or Sex, or Outside Sex by Catherine Monroe. She famously claims that trans people are necessarily psychotic or psychotically structured, deluding themselves into believing they could ever fully inhabit the other sex. She advises against recommending gender confirmation affirmation surgery, arguing that to do so would simply trade one life for another. Skipping ahead several decades, as recently as 2019, the very famous philosopher and psychoanalytic theorist Slavoj Žižek published an article called "Transgender Dogma is Naive and Incompatible with Freud." Also in 2019, noted queer and trans theorist Paul Preciado, if you may have heard of him, famous for terms like pharmacopornographic and dildonics, where he, in a book called The Countersexual Manifesto, he argues that the entire body is a dildo, gave a speech to 3,500 psychoanalysts on the theme of women in psychoanalysis. That's needed. Preciado's speech has been reprinted under the title "Can the Monster Speak? Report to an Academy of Psychoanalysts." Per his report in the prelude to the actual talk, He writes that when he was asked if anyone was queer or trans in the audience, they only laughed or were silent. When he insisted they recognize their responsibility to changes on the landscape of gender and sexuality, he was booed or laughed off. He was only able to read a quarter of his prepared talk. And I've read this talk. It's nothing anyone who's ever taken a gender and sexuality course would be surprised by. I encourage you to read it. It's quick and easy to read. Excuse me. Unsurprisingly, he has now said that he thinks psychoanalysis is bourgeois. And has turned to South American shamanism. Okay, a couple more examples. I hope I'm not shooting myself in the foot too much. In 2021, the equally famous and respected psychoanalyst Jacques-Alain Miller, who's the inheritor of Lacan's name and entire work, in a lecture to a Russian audience, says that, psychoanalysts listen to people. He says that homosexuals are given space to participate, but this should not be the case for trans individuals, because that will validate them. And he goes on to refer to the problem of LGBT propaganda in schools in France. He then presents testimonies by Lacanian members of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, endorsing Miller's ideas, complaining, of course, about the rise of political correctness. Even this year, in 2023, the London Society of the New Lacanian School hosted a conference called Sexual Identities in Transit. In it, another major figure in psychoanalysis and philosophy, Eric Laurent, railed against Judith Butler and their notion of queer and gender performativity as being out of line with psychoanalytic understandings. And I'll admit, there's lots of debate between Butler and psychoanalysis, but this is particularly about a particular aspect of it. Other speakers included noted transphobe, or TERF, if you're okay with it, were Helen Joyce, one of the most vocal anti-trans Twitter folks who often trades commentary with J.K. Rowling and others of the British school. She's recently a book called Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. A friend of mine just wrote a rebuttal to that in a review of books. Okay, finally, one last thing too. From a special edition from this summer of a journal on gender and sexuality on the psychoanalytic concept of perversion. Quote, some years ago, during a conference in Paris, a speaker tackled the issue of contemporary subjectivizing processes through gender and sexual experimentation. When he mentioned queer guys enjoying being penetrated by trans women with a penis and trans men fucking their male or female mates with a strap-on, a well-respected senior analyst from the audience, obviously disconcerted by these unusual pairings, yelled from the first row, "Perverted freaks." Okay, so this is not doing me any favors, right? So I want to now shift into the third part of the talk, where I sort of try to show how psychoanalysis and queer theory and queers are actually co-linked. It shouldn't be hard to see why queer people would be like, why would I trust you? Why would I want to pay any attention to you? Even Gail Rubin, who is, one of the major founding figures of queer theory, once called it retro-psychopath. And of course, in granddaddy of queer theory, Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, he's got many places where he's anti-psychoanalysis, but he rejects the notion that our sexuality should determine or tell us the truth about ourselves, or that we would need an analyst for this. Indeed, this is simply a new form of power or regulation. In his most famous phrase of the book, he writes in that text that while the sodomite had been a temporary aberration, the homosexual is now a species. As according to him, psychoanalysis is part of the medico-juridical establishment that has made queers categorizable pariahs. Okay, so here's where I'm going to see if you believe me. So as I've said before, I consider psychoanalysis, queer theory, and philosophy to be modes of inquiry into the fundamental problem of how to live well. They're not the only ones, but they're the ones that I know. So I find them very helpful tools for understanding, analyzing, deconstructing, and reconstructing the world we live in. In an essay titled Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, the same Foucault claims that knowledge is not made for understanding, it's made for cutting. And so these fields, I think, cut at nature's joints most sharply. Each upends received wisdom simply through the processes of observation and reflection. Psychoanalysts do or should do this, carefully listening and documenting what they hear without condemnation of prefabricated moral frameworks. Then what is queer theory if not an all-out assault on heteronormativity and aggressive cutting into the everyday or the normal? As an example, in an essay titled Sex in Public, Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner described heterosexuality as America's national pastime, something that, far from being held private in bedrooms, can be found everywhere we look. Their title, Sex in Public, is both a description of that and a clarion call for what they call a queer counterpublic. So they end their piece with an infamous example of, the only example in Indian literature I've ever read of what, and I hope you're okay with this, what they call erotic vomiting. So they're at a leather bar, and a 20-something man in a dog collar is trotted on stage where he's fed milk and food in excess, and then he's forced to throw up. It is this point they realize they can't leave, cannot even look away. No one can. The crowd is transfixed by the scene of intimacy and display, control and abandon, ferocity and objection. People are moaning softly with admiration and whistling, stomping, screaming encouragements. We are breathless. Good academics that we are, we also have questions. Word has gone around that he's straight. We want to know, what does that mean here? How do you discover that this is what you want to do? How did you find a male top to do it with? How did you come to do it in a leather bar? What else do you do? How do you feel about your new partner, the audience? So whatever your ethical or aesthetic sensibilities may be about this, has always stood out to me as an effective example of the cutting power of knowledge and a radically queer revaluation of our values. In my view, psychoanalysis is fundamentally concerned with this kind of cut. In a way, my claim is as simple as this. I think it's necessary to highlight the difference between psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis because it highlights the difference in how one asks questions and what observation one makes and concludes from those questions. The fundamental rule of psychoanalysis in practice has always been to say everything that comes to mind no matter what. And the end goal of psychoanalytic training is to be able to actually implement what it calls free-floating attention, to listen to everything equally and bring nothing to bear from your own presuppositions. So, some fundamental insights of psychoanalysis show that in itself it is a queer mode of inquiry. Freud's own comments lead us to this in some senses, right? He thought that analysis showed that all people were capable of making a homosexual object choice, and that all, in fact, had made one in their unconscious. He thought that analysis also showed that libidinal attachments to persons of the same sex play no less a part in normal mental life, and a greater part than do similar attachments to the opposite sex. Okay, so let's look at some implications for the theory itself. For instance, in breaking up the genesis of the body into partial zones, oral, anal, scopic, etc., it effectively dethrones genitalia as the central site of sexuality. Indeed, how many fetishes and practices exist that have nothing to do with genitals, which is queer theory's favorite thing to talk about. Just because non-analysts see this doesn't mean it's not there. Further, as Freud learned, and as Lacan repeatedly avers, there is no normal subject, no subject not beset by psychic asymmetries. The norm is simply a fantasy imposed on the polymorphous perversity of the body. Furthermore, for Lacan, a subject is necessarily a desiring subject, not an egoic subject. The ego, or what we might call our identity, is only a defense, a way of protecting ourselves from our desires and the desires of others. Desire, however, to the identity is what motivates us. So this leads us to a conception of psychoanalysis that analyzes patients who never present deviations from the norm, but rather as specific modes of desiring and constituting one's subjectivity. For psychoanalysis, there's no point in even using the term deviation because all stem from the radically singular way that we subjects form and unform our own attachments, affections, proclivities, and identifications. In the clinic, there should be no presumption of normality or judgment. In the clinic of the couch is, so they say, the place where one can say all the things one doesn't say in polite company. To put it succinctly, if psychoanalysis has taught us anything, it is that human sexuality is imminently perverted, traversed by sadomasochistic spins and power games, that in it pleasure is inextricably tied with pain. Indeed, the radical anti-normative and anti-identitarian implications of psychoanalysis are precisely what have drawn many queer and trans folks to it. Okay, so here I'm going to give you some examples from some recent psychoanalytic texts and case studies that I think bear this out. And again, this is where it gets a little graphic. But just to say, a recent text called Hatred of Sex by theorists Tim Dean and Oliver Davis suggests that, in fact, psychoanalysis is more queer than queer theory. So when I started reading queer theory, I was drawn to all sorts of stuff. My final paper for my graduate queer theory seminar was on gay male bareback sex or condomless sex, contrasting David Halperin's What Do Gay Men Want with Tim Dean's Unlimited Intimacy, Reflections on the Subculture of Bareback. But both of these papers attempt to come to an understanding of why gay men may risk contracting HIV by having condomless sex. This is pre-PrEP. They do so from starkly different perspectives. Halperin argues that the positing of the Freudian death drive means that we would have to reckon with some monstrous wish that gay men have, a monstrous wish for death that gay men have, which, of course, I'm not a fan of. I think this understanding of death drive is wrong, but Dean's book offers a more compelling argument for understanding psychic mechanisms of identification, imaginary fantasies of community and descent, and quite simply the recognition that for human sexuality, quite literally anything can come on to take erotic significance, including, for some people, the human immunodeficiency virus. In this case, rather than pathologizing or demonizing sexual behavior, psychoanalysis gives a strong model for interpreting rather than decrying it. So again, I argue that psychoanalysis insists on a necessary deviance, and I can't think of anything more queer than that. A couple more examples, and then I'll be done, I promise. In the famous book, well, I keep using famous, famous in small circles, No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, Lee Edelman makes a striking and notorious argument for the queerness of psychoanalysis by pitting his Lacanian reading against what he calls reproductive futurism, his term for the child-oriented nature of public and political discourse. Rather than argue that, well, of course queer people can have and love children, he says that queers and queer theory should embrace our pariah and antisocial status. In our very societal negativity, queers are anti-child. Not everyone likes this argument. But the pearl clutching and worrying, what do you think of the children, is precisely what queer theory says, fuck you too, and a society of adults, all of whom, again, are inherently non-normative because of the nature of psychic and sexual life. This leads Edelman to quote, or to state boldly, on every side, our enjoyment of liberty is eclipsed by the lengthening shadow of a child whose freedom to develop undisturbed by encounters, or even by the threat of potential encounters, with an otherness of which its parents, its church, or the state do not approve, uncompromised by any possible access to what is painted as alien desire, terroristically holds us all in check and determines that political discourse confirms the logic of the narrative, wherein history unfolds as the future envisioned for a child who must never grow up. So we have a fantasy of the child as this innocent figure who will not become queer unless you say gay in public school, or they get the internet when they shouldn't, or they see a trans person on TikTok, right? So I've been reading a lot about the efforts to ban books in schools, and every person who I see testify really vaunts this idea of childhood innocence, right? The child has an innocence that they'll never get back if they see someone have sex or something like that. He says, I imagine just deliriously delighted with himself for saying this. I apologize for your language. Fuck the social order and the child in whose name we're collectively terrorized. Fuck Annie. Fuck the way from Les Mis. Fuck the poor innocent kid on the internet. Fuck laws both with capital L's and small. Fuck the whole network of symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop, which is pretty strikingly queer. In the 2023 book, Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, and Traumatophilia, Avi Sakatopoulou describes what she calls limit consent. In our consent-heavy discursive field, she wants to remind us just how radical psychoanalysis is in its reflections on sexuality. Limit consent takes seriously the fact that consent, strictly speaking, is not possible because we never really know where sexuality will take us, and also that there are many possibilities for sexuality that take us outside of ourselves or indeed shatter ourselves with subjectivities. So he gives 3 examples that I'll try to go over. So first, in her chapter titled To Suffer Pleasure, I can only get that tattooed on me, she tells us about her analysis in Adam. In the 4th year of his 4 times weekly psychoanalysis, he described the following experience. He and his lover were in a foreign country visiting a bathhouse. Adam was engaging in activities when a stranger walked into the room. The stranger's whole being screamed objection. He wore a yellowed, stained jockstrap, his hair was greasy, he reeked of cigarettes. Adam found this man ugly, instantly repulsive. He began to feel queasy. His lover left the room in disgust, but Adam hesitated. He had the urge to leave, but felt himself strangely compelled, torn between his repulsion and his desire opening up in his body. Adam stayed in the room transfixed by this filthy man. He not only had sex with this abject stranger, though it's not clear what he means by sex, the experience, he told me, was intensely memorable, told Bobby. When orgasm came, he said, I exploded into thousands of tiny pieces, was hanging out in space like overheated pieces of dust. In the chapter Risking Sexuality Beyond Consent, she writes of the erotics of overwhelm, where one is quite literally overwhelmed by an erotic encounter that takes one by surprise. She quotes an anecdote of Tim Dean, who I've mentioned already, also in a bathhouse, writing that a man pushed me to my knees. My mouth registered that his jockstrap was already damp. When I became aware that he was gently urinating through the jock, I spontaneously ejaculated. Both his urine and my body's response took me completely by surprise. I did not consent and would not have consented to being urinated on, but I loved it. That night, the man in the leather cap, whose face I never saw, gave me the gift of erotic astonishment. And the final example that I'm going to go over is between 2 women, Raven and Isabel. Placing leather restraints on Raven's wrist, she tied her hands behind her back. She then blindfolded her, positioning her with her back against the wall. She proceeded to carefully thread a hypodermic needle through her skin below the collarbone. She continued symmetrically with more needles all the way down to Raven's thigh on both sides of her body. She removed her own clothing and mirrored the same in her own body. After she was done, she threaded an elastic thread through the corresponding needles. She removed her blindfold. She saw them literally tied together. With her eyes locked, Isabella took a step back, causing the strings to become taut. Stretched, the strings pulled on their skin, bringing about a painful sensation. Isabella's skin hurt, and she knew the same was true of Raven's. She stayed alert to her body, knowing the contours of her emotional life. She felt she would be able to discern the limits of what Raven's body could bear. Slowly moving her body further away from Raven's, she began intensifying the pull on the strings. This, with the intense eye contact, was intoxicating to them both. Awash in this dysregulating experiential oversaturation, she felt that she was coming undone, that she was being ripped apart, broken open by the experience. So on the couch in the clinic, subjects can freak freely about their desires and experiences and practices, putting to words that which may seem ineffable. These experiences are decidedly queer, and rather than pathologizing, the analytic structure and queer nature of psychoanalysis allow it to take in and analyze these desires in ways that are fundamentally at odds with any form of normativity at all. Despite the reaction of a room full of psychoanalysts to Paul Preciado on the topic of gender, be it cis, trans, or somewhere in between, psychoanalysis also offers its queerness. In a book from this year called Gender Without Identity, the authors offer an extended account of a genderqueer and non-binary patient. Because psychoanalysis sees the psyche as composed of ego and unconscious, it elaborates an architecture for the development of the ego through processes of identification, introjection, intermission, repression, and other mechanisms. That is to say, there is no essential core gender identity, to quote a term made famous by psychoanalyst Robert Stoller. That's not to say we don't have identities or genders, but there's no one way that these gendered identities come into being. And there's therefore no direct correspondence between psychic life and embodiment, for instance. In seeing us as fundamentally subjects of desire, not of being, psychoanalysis allows for the elaboration of any number of identities that run afoul of cis normativity, just as there is no normativity for sexuality, nor is there for gender. As subjects of desire, both conscious and unconscious, we are constantly in conflict with ourselves, undercut by an unconscious that the underbelly of our conscious experiences. Last paragraph, promise. Finally, to wrap up, I'm not really over, because we started late. Okay, so finally to wrap up in this talk, I try to give you a sense of how I've come to have the positions that I hold, starting with a nerdy gay kid in Arkansas who liked books. I've constructed a theoretical home for myself out of the fields I've tried to describe today. Psychoanalysis elaborates the psychogenesis of the subject riven by desire and drive, the subject who finds itself only where it's not, and of the subject with all of its various and glorious perversions. Despite the historical misdeeds of the institution, I'm firmly of the belief that psychoanalysis is a tool for cutting, hollowing out a space for the recognition of ourselves as always deviant and, in fact, therefore, always already queer. Done. Well, that's a lot to put out there. But thank you for letting me do that. It was helpful for me to actually put all that into words, so I appreciate it.
I'm glad that this ended up being a space where that was possible.
Yeah.
So I think there are lots of different ways in which I can imagine some questions and conversations going, right? This is weaving together so many different narratives. So I want to open up the floor for some questions. I've got some if there are others that don't pop up, but I see Sandra already immediately.
So Freud talks, and you talked about this. Freud, he believed that the sexuality was fluid, and later the libido pushes it towards one end of the spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just thinking about conflicting desires and jouissance. Is there a way in which like the specter of bisexuality kind of haunts psychoanalysis, and are there any explanations for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, some people say that Freud argues that we're all originarily bisexual, and then it sort of bifurcates into one or the other. The thing that and I don't know if this will be helpful, the thing that I'm going to answer with Lacan. The thing that I think is useful in Lacan is in Lacan's distinction between, if you're familiar with the registers of imaginary, the real and symbolic, you have drive at the level of the real, desire at the level of the symbolic, and identity at the level of the imaginary. So I think for Lacan, what you get, if you look at the kind of development of drive into desire that then kind of congeals into identity, if you see it through those three registers, the claim of sexuality as bisexuality, homosexuality, whatever, that exists, I think, for Lacan on the imaginary level. And so what Lacan thinks the ethical act of analysis is to help us, in a way, get past that level of imaginary identification, because that's where we get in so much trouble. That's where we don't know. That's when we get in conflict, right? So just think of myself. Well, don't think of me, but yeah, an example, like I would have fantasies about men, and they'd be like, "That's not who I am," right? And so I think a lot of times what people go to psychoanalysis for is some kind of problem with not being able to express, with not feeling at home in their sexuality or at home in their desire. It's the way I describe myself to my analyst. So I think for Lacan, there is no originary sexuality. There's only drive, which then gets filtered through language and identification. And it's hard to get out of that, right? So I think for Lacanians, which I include myself in, the starting with a sexuality as a term is sort of the top layer, but then that's not where we stop. Makes sense? Should I?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
So in your talk, you're trying to sort of rehabilitate psychoanalysis partially through splitting it from particular psychoanalysts. But I was wondering, is it possible to rehabilitate certain psychoanalysts or philosophers or thinkers? I mean, you brought up the example of Slavoj Žižek, but to that we can add Michel Foucault, who supported the abolition of the age of consent. Obviously Heidegger, who joined the Nazi Party. Even Karl Marx, who wrote on the Jewish question despite himself being Jewish. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's almost akin to the ongoing debate of separating the art from the artist, right? I hate to say you have to take on a case-by-case basis because I don't think that's a good answer. But I think, so we had a professor at Duquesne who wrote many books on how Heidegger's Nazism infiltrated every aspect of his philosophy. I'm not sure that I find that convincing. If that is true, then we have to rethink all sorts of things. Foucault is not the only person to have signed that. Beauvoir signed it, so all sorts of other people did. Jean Genet, if you know who that is, he famously loved sex with boys, as it were. So, do I think it's possible to find useful ideas or productive ideas in thinkers who have less than savory personal issues? Yes, I do. And whether that's let me answer it through psychoanalysis. So, for some interpretations of Lacanian psychoanalysis, what we take is the signifier. We take the word as it is, and what free-floating attention is to read the chain of signification or chain of signifiers as it is constituted, and not sort of. We might try to find out or identify an unconscious desire in that. But I don't think that the idea is to then condemn a person based on their desire. Whether that actually works in terms of the direct and measurable harm that may have been caused by some of these people is a different question. But I think if we take them qua text, yes. If it's true though that it is really inescapable that Foucault's support of eliminating the age of consent really influenced all of his ideas about sexuality, or if it's true that Heidegger's Nazism really influenced every aspect of his theory, then we might have a different question. But I've always been of the view that yes, that it's possible, and that and potentially productive.
Yeah. You mentioned Friedman says this point of kind of absolute negativity or I guess like the real of desire. And I wanted to ask whether you think that if this kind of just puts queer folks in the same position that they've been put in like structurally by society, and that there isn't something to say, I guess, being able to name a desire and put something out as a concrete identity.
Right. Yeah. I think that in No Future, Edelman at least makes the argument that the queer is the negative, right? And that what queer theory, if what queer theory wants is to be anti-normative, then we just say, well, yeah, we do hate your kids, right? Of course, I don't mean that that's like to take that as an actual thing, but the argument is queer theory has everything to gain from accepting the status of queers as social outcasts, right? And queer theoretical critiques of things like gay marriage or gays in the military are, I think, also rooted in that same principle. That it's also similar to why people don't like "quote unquote" respectability politics, right? Whether that's a viable position, I'm not kind of evaluating at the moment, but I think for Edelman at least, it does do that, but that's a good thing. So when I teach, for instance, when I teach sex and sexualities, we had a week where we had a class on asexuality, we had a class on non-binariness, we had a class on cisness. And one thing that students always say that they're always really drawn to is that, well, identifying yourself as a sexuality provides you with community, right? And that's important. We all need community. We need community. That's what makes our lives good, I think. What makes my life good, at least. Well, if we could call my life good, but qualifications aside. But I think that to go back to Lacan again, the claim of an identity is the temporary hypostatization of these other things that are going on. So if what you find useful in claiming identity is community, is seeing yourself in someone else, is, I didn't mention this, but in my early life journal years, what that is, I joined a music group called Indie Folks, and that's where I found people who like the same music as me, and that's where I found my first internet boyfriend, who lived in Toronto, Jordan, with 2 A's, in case you're curious. So I think all of that is important. I think, and I don't think anyone would deny that we have imaginary attachments and their significance. But I think the problem then becomes, and this comes up a lot in debates about quote unquote identity politics, they very often can become so congealed that they end up losing their significance and you end up clinging to something rather than seeing the fluidity that's underneath it. So I think as a temporary and necessary step, yes, but if you let that be the ending point, then it becomes, or can become. This is another reason why I like psychoanalysis so much, because it gives me the language to talk through on this stuff.
Wait. I want to make sure somebody else doesn't have a question.
Yeah.
I was like, Alex, wait. Other questions, other things. Like, there are lots of other touch points related to other things we've talked about here, too. The idea of recognition and how that's related to identity, even the idea of fluidity or dynamism, right? In some of our other conversations, there might be other ways that you can find other kind of touch points related to other things we've talked about. And then we'll come back to you. No other questions.
You all just zone out the whole time. You're like, oh, he's talking so much and so fast.
I have lots of furious note taking.
Or I'm messaging. I always ask my students, I'm like, what are you doing? You can check me.
I was not checking. All right, Alex.
This might end up taking you down sort of the similar path that their two questions took you down, but in your talk you mentioned queerness as like a method of inquiry, which I thought was really interesting, especially since you sort of separated queerness from queer theory. So I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so obviously I wouldn't have come to, so it's interesting, that's what I sort of started with the narrative, because whether I would have become the same kind of figure you see before you if I weren't gay, or in Arkansas in the 90s, whatever, I don't know that I would have come to the same thing. So obviously these kind of things are significant. And they're significant as we sort of come into ourselves and figure out who we are. And that's sort of how I wanted to frame it, as like trying to find a place for myself or understand myself was necessarily involved some recognition of my own desire as being directed primarily towards cis men. So that's So I think that's significant. But I think what queer theory wants to do, in particular in works like assemblage theory with Jasper Puar, or I don't know if you've read that, or even if we just want to use the term intersectionality, what queer theory wants to do is to move us beyond these claims to identity that see us as strictly delimited. So, so one thing, a text I was just reading earlier today is called The War on Sex by David Halperin. And one thing that he mentions and that other folks in queer theory mention is that there's a surprising lack of affinity between, so one of the ways that gay people made some headway in decriminalizing themselves, or allowing for themselves to make cases to be decriminalized, to make those political bargains, involved basically championing policies and positions that increased surveillance, regulation, and carceral punishment for other kinds of sexual deviance. So one thing that I think queer theory wants to point out is, and you don't have to accept it, of course, qualify everything with that, is that when you put, if you delimit the notion of queerness into a kind of sexual practice rather than a mode of inquiry, then you might lose the ability to see how it cuts into all these different kinds of intersections. That may be a problem because it may dissolve everything into so much that we lose any sense of togetherness at all, and then we just have a bunch of atomistic things that collide every once in a while. That's sort of, I think, what Butler means by coalitional politics in her early work, or their early work. That changes over time. But when I talk about queerness as a mode of inquiry, I recognize that it's sort of just as similar to the first question. It starts from a position of the imaginary, but then it sort of moves backwards into this more, this is almost like Toulouse and Guattari-ish, more kind of subterranean processes of flows and desires and such. Like that. Yep.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, whenever I teach Freud, it's like, I think the questions he asks are much more interesting than the answers. And it's about asking those kinds of questions, which I think you're affirming and I'm affirming with you. But I'm curious why, if you have a thought or an orientation to why psychoanalysis seems to have treated and engaged with sexuality, with gender, to such a degree, right? To such an extent, like just so deeply, but not really race. And I'm curious if there are resources. I mean, I'm of course thinking about Fanon,
Right.
was interested in psychoanalysis. But are there contemporary scholars, intellectual psychoanalysts that are engaged in this work right now that you're familiar with?
Yeah. So a book. Sheldon George is a name that I can give you a list of names if you want that. But Sheldon George, the book just came out on Lacan and Race, edited by Derek Hook, who's at Duquesne. A woman named, what's her first name? Her last name is Shadri Crooks. She wrote a book called Desiring Whiteness. There's a man named Willie Apollon, who is a French-Canadian man in Montreal, who's very famous for a program called Gay Freak. He is a black man. He makes a similar argument that for some of these folks, for some Lacanians, racial discrimination, and I'm not saying I endorse this, but racial discrimination, it's a byproduct of the fundamental failure of sexual difference. So some psychoanalysts, in particular some Lacanians, will subordinate questions of race to question of sex, because for them, the fundamental difference of sexuation obtains within any racial category, whether that's fair or not.
Well, you invoked that being in your talk, like the fundamental question of sexual difference.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I'm a white guy, so that's one take on it. There's it's growing more popular, common linkage in publications between Afro-pessimism and Lacanian psychoanalysis, right? So in a book from the guy Emery, not George, I can't remember the name of the book. I think it's called Lacan and Afro-Pessimism, actually. The author, it's a very difficult book. I can't pretend to say that I understand it fully. But for him, the argument is that psychoanalysis, in particular Lacanian psychoanalysis, is necessarily based on an occlusion or scotomization of race, right? So for him, I can't remember his name, David. Anyway, for him, he argues that in Lacan's use of Aristotle, for instance, he's referencing when Aristotle discusses slavery, and so for him, there's like already this occult signifier of blackness that's covered over in Lacan's full formulation of our subservience to the signifier. So for him, that's that claim does exploit a sexual difference, but it does say that Lacan does that. That's a little more complicated answer than I meant to give, sorry.
I think it's a good answer that kind of circles back to one of the questions that Alex was asking about, also understanding the difference between the theory and the theorist, right? Is that maybe there is a failure of a particular theorist, in this case Lacan, to understand something to do with race, and maybe there's this subservience, but that other people are picking up the theories. So I think maybe we answered part of that question again.
Yeah, right.
Different way.
Great.
We circled that back.
What's the
So I'm really interested in this idea. In psychoanalysis, I think that there's a different formulation of the idea of being anti-normative. And you kind of alluded to this, right? And this is the way we started the class. So everybody in here who's in my class of philosophy, sex, and love, right? We started the class talking about queer theory as fundamentally being defined in terms of being anti-normative. But we didn't really do much exploration of what the normative meant there. Because Mathieu had a different view than Marinucci had about what the normative was. And so, yeah. And so we didn't do a lot. And I think you're proposing something different. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about what does it mean to be anti-normative as a queer psychoanalyst? Like in the context of psychoanalysis, what would that mean to be anti-normative in that sense?
Okay. Yeah, so I will start by maybe saying something about the normative and queer theory. I think that there's an issue of identical differences that came out a few years ago that was very critical of the use of normativity and anti-normativity in queer theory, because it argued that it's never defined, right? If I ask my students this in queer theory and in LGBTQ studies all the time, I'm like, give me examples of heteronormativity. They don't have any difficulty in doing that. But how that's defined and what is considered normative is difficult if we're trying to decide whether it's a common practice, if it's what we believe to be common, if it's what is represented in TV or what people actually do, etc. So in that regard, I think psychoanalysis will say, not to keep going back to the same concepts, sorry everybody, that form of normativity is based on an imaginary projection of what normativity is, right? It's rather than, and so I think what psychoanalysis wants to do is to say that, okay, that's fine. We all sort of operate, if I call myself queer, or if I call myself radical, or if I call myself not like the people at the restaurant I go to in Jonesboro, Arkansas when I visit my parents, whatever it is that I might do to assert myself, that's cool, that's fine. That's another form of something important that we have to do for ourselves. But psychoanalytic anti-normativity basically puts that within every individual psyche, right? So anti-normativity in psychoanalysis is not simply saying that I'm not like you, which of course that is something, or that you do that thing and I go get my septum pierced or whatever, which I do have, it's just not in right now. Or you read, I don't know, who knows, Harry Potter, and I read William Burroughs and whatever, there's that. But for psychoanalysis, that's a defense we tell ourselves to keep ourselves away from our own lack of normativity within ourselves. So to use a kind of complicated example from a Lacanian essay, Lacan Sade, he argues that the golden rule to love another as you love yourself is impossible. Because if we love another as we love ourselves, that means we have to love them knowing that they're capable of whatever kind of weird, terrible stuff we think every once in a while, or whatever kind of weird desires or demands that we may have that we may not like, that may not accord with our sense of self. So for my money, which I don't have, psychoanalysis sort of moves the discussion of normativity to a different register.
I think it's helpful. One of the reasons why I wanted to get at that too is I think, and again, to help maybe make some touchstones on some other things for some of y'all too, is that actually helps to connect this to the notion of dynamism, right? And the idea that there is no static point of identity ecologically, that it's constantly in this flux as well, and in this constant process of kind of reevaluating how flourishing can be understood in the flux is really similar to what's being described in the kind of anti-normative identity.
There's an essay called The Three Ecologies of Fluids Materia. It doesn't matter. I read it, the concept or something. And he uses this word that I didn't know, which is stroboscopic. And that's like if you Google image search stroboscopic, the one that made sense to me was like, there's a basketball bouncing, but you just see all the images of the basketball going like that. And so stroboscopic refers to, you see the thing bouncing, but really what's going on is this sort of like series of instances that are connected together. So the kind of like flux underneath is sort of what I think goes back to what you're discussing. So I think that just came to mind as maybe a helpful visual.
Yeah.
It's a good word too.
It is.
I have a running vocab list on my phone. It's exciting to fall. So stroboscopic is on there now.
That's really good. Any other questions? All right, y'all.
Thank you for coming. I hope you didn't hate it. If you did, you can email me here.